So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third day of the Open Educational Symposium. My name is Kim Wardrop, and I am here to introduce you to the first session of the day, which is Educational Technologies for Open Pedagogies. We are joined by Cal Murgu and Tim Ribaric from Brock University, and they're going to talk about some of the open source programs that they have used for open pedagogies. So with that, gentlemen, I shall pass it on to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here. As Kimberly said, we're here to talk about some educational technologies that we've instituted here at Brock for open educational practices. A bit of a summary of today. So we'll just introduce ourselves a little bit and how we got here. We'll talk a little bit about what we're doing from the perspective of infrastructure for open pedagogy. That was a theme that kind of resonated yesterday about who controls our infrastructure and what choices can we make about infrastructure to support open pedagogy. So we want to pick that thread up and talk a bit about it. And then we'll dive into the what I think you're all here for, these two paths that we've established here at Brock. And the first path is for developing open educational resources using GitHub Pages, static site generators, and H5P. And the second path, Tim will take that on, is about using Jupyter notebooks and Google Colab to teach programming concepts to students, both novices and programmers alike. And then we'll just conclude and answer any questions you might have. So just very quickly, my name's Cal Murgu. I'm currently the instructional design librarian at Brock University, and I've been here since October of 2020. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I'm still addicted despite all these years of trying not to be.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Ribaric. I've been working at Brock for 15 years now, and I currently have the title of Digital Scholarship Librarian.
So let's talk a little bit about a question of infrastructure. So yesterday, like I said, we discussed, who has control and how do we have control over the technologies that we use to set up open educational practices. And I think this is one of the most important questions that we need to discuss with our colleagues at our own institution and then in forums like this one. Because in one way, the infrastructure that you have available will directly influence what you can do with your faculty colleagues, in your classrooms, with other librarians, et cetera. And the infrastructure that you choose is influenced by a few different things, including your institution's values and the amount of resourcing or lack thereof that they contribute to these values of openness. And when I speak about resourcing, I don't just mean technical or financial resources, but I mean human resources as well, the number of people that you have that you can deploy in this space. And that leads me directly to support internally within the institution and externally outside of your institution and the communities of practice that you've established. And then finally, something that we've talked quite a bit about is this notion of sustainability and to what extent will open pedagogical practices, while open, to what extent are they sustainable going forward? What happens if somebody leaves your institution? And so vendors that you're probably familiar with, including Articulate and iSpring and Adobe, have identified these influential elements and have essentially said, we'll offer you really polished commercial solutions that will allow you to kind of sidestep some of these problems, right? So you can sidestep the resourcing issue by just paying a little bit more money. You can sidestep the fact that somebody might leave your institution by having support available and also easy and polished authoring tools that allow you to create content relatively easily. And so the question then is, should we just sort of give in to these commercial interests? Should we give in to these really polished authoring tools that allow us to do things very quickly? Or is there value in taking time and considering using some of the open source tools and technologies that we'll be talking about today to create kind of these homegrown solutions? And we'll speak a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of this path. And I'm sure Tim will agree with me. We don't want to be prescriptive here and say that this is the way you should do things. Certainly, Brock has its share of commercial software and enterprise software that we use. But I think we will have succeeded if we can get you to at least test drive some of these tools in the future. Tim, did you want to add anything on this slide?
No, I think you summarized it very well, Cal. The only thing I will add is I'm embarking on a dissertation. This is more grad school for me, where I'm investigating this very thing, whether it's worth doing in-house or paying the extra money. So this is a very compelling topic for me, in other words, and Cal summarized it really well.
Let's embark on the first path. And the first path is, can you create quality e-learning using open tools? So my argument for the next few minutes is that I think you can. And to do so, we will leverage three distinct tools. So the first is GitHub Pages, and you'll see the asterisks there. GitHub Pages, GitHub is not open source in itself, but it does operate under an open spirit. It's owned by Microsoft. But Git, the underlying technology that makes GitHub available, is open source. And there are other options as well, such as GitLab. So perhaps you'll allow me the creative freedom there, but I'm happy to answer any questions about, do I have any issues with using GitHub, and calling it open in this way? But another technology is called Hugo, which is a static site generator. Some of you might be familiar with something like Jekyll, built in Ruby, but Hugo is another option to quickly create high quality websites with just a few lines of code. And then the final one is H5P. I believe most of us are probably familiar with it. In Ontario, we have the eCampus Ontario H5P Studio, which hosts many of these elements for us. So how do we bring these three technologies together to create open e-learning? Well, GitHub Pages serves as our essentially hosting service. It's free and open in the sense that all of the files that are being ran and are being sent to the client are available for you to review. You could download all of our files at any time and review our content. Hugo is a modern static site generator, and which has become really popular lately because you can build websites really quickly. They are small files because there's not a lot going on. There's no databases to run these websites. They're essentially just flat HTML files. And so they're easy to transport and carry and move and edit. And then finally, H5P is an open source framework for developing e-learning, right? So a direct competitor, I would say, to something like the Articulate product line, including Rise. So bringing these together looks something a bit like this. So this is kind of a schematic for what you'll see. GitHub Pages serves as the host for everything. And because it has the ability to publicly share our files in our repository, as well as accept pull requests from other people that want to participate, and allows others to freely fork our work. So in other words, take our work and add it to their own accounts and essentially start building on their own. This is a huge open practice. Then we use Hugo to generate the static website that sits in GitHub Pages. So Hugo has a series of templates or themes that allows us to quickly create modular learning content with relatively little time and effort. Now, this themable aspect is really important because it allows you to create one template for a variety of content types and then apply that template over and over and over again, rather than having to build the website from scratch as you would, if you remember your GeoCities page, you don't have to do any of that. And then finally, the content, the modular content itself is H5P elements or our H5P elements. So either H5P elements that are interactive presentations or interactive video. All of these are created in the H5P editor in eCampus Ontario, and we drop those into our Hugo website, and then we upload everything to GitHub Pages. So what's involved in this? A flowchart, Tim recommended one the other day, I think is a really great idea. So we create a new repository in GitHub Pages, and that's all we do in GitHub Pages for a while. Then comes the hard part, the actual designing and creating of the learning content. We don't dive into that here today, but I know many of you have experience in this, and you know that this is where the real work is. But infrastructurally, I'll just say that there's an iterative nature to developing content using H5P, And you will have to circle back again and again as you go from storyboard to audio, to graphics, and then finally to putting it all together in H5P. Then once we have our content and we know how it looks like, we have to create our static website that will serve as the portal or the user experience for learners. And after we've generated our website with Hugo, we upload and publish directly to GitHub Pages. And frankly, the work doesn't stop there. We come back to developing content as we either review content based on user feedback, or we plan for new content in the future. So in broad strokes, this is the flowchart. So let's just see how some of these activities happen in person. So this is me creating a new repository in GitHub. It literally takes just a few moments. I'll run it one more time because I'm going through it pretty quickly here. But essentially, you go to github.com, you create an account, and then you simply create a new repository by clicking on, you guessed it, new, and adding a repository name, a description if you want, setting it as public, adding a README file so people know why you did this, and of course, a license that allows people to use it. That's the repository being set up. The second part, the difficult part, is designing content. So what you're seeing here is an interactive video in H5P that also includes branching. So we use these for our activities. We create the videos using something called Toonly, and then we use H5P elements to create either the activities like this one. So for example, identifying the main concepts in the context of an information literacy lesson. H5P allows you to put this stuff together and essentially allow you to give students a knowledge check opportunity based on the learning objectives that you have for each lesson. So this is just kind of a simple answer the question, but there are a lot of different elements, as many of you know. So, you don't have to use the tool specifically here. You don't even have to use H5P. But the nature of H5P that allows it to be easily embeddable in a website is a real boon for us. So we try to use it. Then you open up once you finish some of that content, you can generate your Hugo website. And to start a new website with Hugo, one line of code. And you just put that in a terminal and it creates a new static website that you can then run by just using another line of code, Hugo Serve. And that runs the website in your local client. And that's basically it. From there, you can add a new theme. You could add content. That's all it takes to generate a new website using Hugo. So you could preview that website. So for example, this is a Hugo website that is very basic. I also added a theme to it that is an online learning theme. And you can see that in just a few simple steps, you have a functioning website that mirrors a lot of the other e-learning outlets, kind of like Coursera style, or a docs or a how-to type of website. And you can edit most of this. In fact, you could edit all of this. You have complete control. And it's just a matter of getting familiar with the way that these templates are created. Once you're done with your content, if you've uploaded it to your folder on your machine, you just have to use a few Git commands to push that content over to GitHub Pages. Remember, we created a repository in the first step. Now we're adding everything to that repository to make it publicly available on the web. And so while these steps are pretty quick, and I'm happy to answer more questions and even meet at another time to go through them in more detail, the result of these is something like this, which is what we've developed here at Brock. And we call this the Brock Library Digital Learning Portal. It's a series of lessons around information literacy concepts, and it's all built in Hugo. And you'll see here that our lessons are structured in a really familiar way. So we have learning objectives, we have videos using H5P interactive objects. We have more videos using interactive objects. And then we have activities that also use H5P. In this case, it's a branching scenario question that you saw earlier. And we have some assessment. And then the ability to export these lessons in a common cartridge format so that instructors can upload their lessons to our learning management system, Sakai. So you might be asking what skills are required. Well, comfort with the command line, albeit very minimal, is necessary. And this is really a great opportunity to play around with Git and Hugo to a degree. Once you have a project in mind, I find it's often it's easier to learn this kind of stuff. Comfort with GitHub repositories, basic HTML and CSS is also helpful. And if you want to go wild, you can also play around with some JavaScript if you want to get really interactive. And then access to H5P authoring editor if you want to go this route, but it's not necessary. As I said, these are just basic HTML websites. So you could embed whatever you want in something like an iframe. So if you already have Articulate and you use Rise, you can embed that stuff directly in your GitHub Pages Hugo website, and you're good to go. But I would recommend trying to play around with H5P if you can. So what are the advantages of this route? Well, you control everything. So for the librarians in the room, goodbye SpringShare libguides, which is a hill I will die on. I can't wait. You control every aspect of the user experience. You control every aspect of design. You control every aspect of where everything is. So this is a lot of power. Now, static websites are just simple HTML files with some cascading style sheets and maybe some JavaScript sprinkled in. What this means is there are no databases or heavy infrastructure to lug around. You don't have to contact ITS to set up a new database for you. There's not a lot of necessarily maintenance, really, apart from some updates in GitHub that are kind of automatic. And it's very easy to transfer this stuff from one spot to another. For example, if you don't like GitHub Pages anymore, you could always go to GitLab Pages, and you can easily transfer this content over, and you're ready to go in just a few steps. The other aspect of control is that you could sidestep institutional and bureaucratic red tape. I don't know about the institutions where you work, but the institution where I work and Tim works, there is a significant amount of that. So with respect to that, you can set up a GitHub website and link to that. And now you don't have to go through all of those different mechanisms to get something up and running. And finally, the advantage of this route is that you see how the sausage gets made, and that the technical skill that is required, you will grow as you continue to do more interesting things. And there are these personal and professional challenges in building from scratch in this way that might prove really fulfilling to some of you. It's not for everybody, certainly. And if you don't have the infrastructural values or institutional values in place to support this kind of work, then it might be more of a headache than it's worth. But for those of you that have that kind of support, please consider that. And then finally, disadvantages. It wouldn't be good if I didn't tell you why this doesn't always work. So you control everything, meaning that you have to take into account every aspect of your website. Every aspect of your e-learning experience has to be accounted for. And so this takes time and resourcing. And frankly, like I said, it might not be worth the hassle if you don't have that sort of support. It's tough to connect to Gradebook for interested instructors. So I have, for the instructors that have exported our common cartridges, they are always looking to connect our H5P elements to the Gradebook in our LMS. Unfortunately, there is no easy link. So that is one disadvantage if you're looking for that kind of assessment. The institutional red tape is sometimes helpful and adds to this notion of legitimacy of a website. The reason why our Brock TNL website looks the way it does is because we want it to look a lot like our brocku.ca website, so that it has that notion of authenticity and legitimacy, and that the user feels like they're in the same environment when they click out. So that is one way to get around that. And then finally, accessibility considerations. Having just gone through a pretty significant accessibility review of our website and having fixed a lot of contract issues, something like LibGuides or SpringShare LibGuides does a lot of that stuff already in the way that it allows you to author content. When you're developing everything from scratch, you need to account for it. So it's just an added kind of burden. Burden in the sense that you have to sit there and go through the review rather than allowing your editor or allowing your authoring software to essentially make those decisions ahead of time. So I'm going to pass it over to Tim. Now we're going to move over to not open educational resources, but actually moving over to the learning experience of a student, perhaps in real time and asynchronously. Tim, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Cal. So Cal's presentation focused a lot on the autonomy that static site generators Hugo Hub allows you to exercise as teachers. What I'm going to attempt to demonstrate to you for the second half of this session is a look at a platform that is really reducing the learning curve that you need to put across to your learners when you're picking up and teaching technical skills, and even sort of outside of technical skills as well, right? So one of the big concerns, questions, problems is, getting everyone on the same page. The computers that they work on, the browsers that they use are all different. Some people have the ability to install software. Harkening back to that red tape sort of question from earlier, how can you be sure that, a heterogeneous group of learners from all over the world have access to a particular platform in a sensible way? So what we're going to do is take a look at a tool that I think sort of spreads out and smooths that process. So in a nutshell, this is a platform called Jupyter Notebooks. And Jupyter Notebooks are these interactive web pages that have embedded chunks of code in them. They're built on an open standard, so an open access standard, created by the Python Foundation. And much like GitHub is some version of Git, we have the same parallel here. We have Jupyter Notebooks as the generic thing, and then we use it on different platforms and different versions. The one I'm going to focus on today is a platform from Google called Google Colab, which I find very, very, very useful for teaching technical skills in an asynchronous online environment. Okay, so we'll go with that. Thank you. I'll go so far as to call this a new paradigm. So you present a web page to an interested learner. They go through the web page alongside you, and they don't have to install any additional software. In fact, they don't even need to come to terms with what all of the software and the code is that you're working on. They just need to follow along and participate after some prompts. So this paradigm is used in various different languages. R, you get something similar with that, in a very technical language called Julia, but for the most part, you'll get it for Python. And then we'll see in our example, actual hands-on portion, you don't necessarily need to focus on the computing language that you're looking at. You can actually focus on the concepts you need, and then you can go from there. So this is a snapshot of a notebook interface in action. So it's available through your browser. It's a WYSIWYG sort of deal. You get the components of these pages are called cells. So cells come in two varieties. One is a HTML or Markdown cell. So that's where you do your description, your inline your images, put together your tables or whatever it is you need, and then you follow that with a code cell. And the code cell is an embedded sort of chunk of code that once you hit the play button, get into some technical detail, will fire up a virtual machine that creates an environment that executes your code. And this is the horsepower that's involved. So if you run it on your machine locally, like this screen capture here, you're relying on the resources on your machine, which is useful in some senses. But let's take a step now to the next way you can interact with a Jupyter Notebook through Google Colab. So you can do something similar with Google Colab. You fire up one of these notebook pages, you hit the play button, and then it runs on some data center. And Google allocates you the equipment and the cores and the RAM and all the technical stuff. And then because Google is offering this platform for free in a very accessible way, you only need a Google account. You can connect to it and then share a copy of this notebook to each of the learners in the room you're teaching, and they each get a virtual machine hosted for them where they can run their instance of this notebook. So Google Colab is not yeah, we'll see how this works once we hit the exercise. Google Colab is certainly not the only platform in town. So once again, this is another extension of the fact that these are open access tools. If you're just running it on the machine in front of you, you've probably heard or will hear of a platform called Anaconda. If you're at a Canadian university that has some research, computation research, Compute Canada, which is a resource available to you, has a Jupyter Notebook interface. And then, the Google Colab, I think, is quickly becoming one of the most popular versions or ways to do this. So, the great thing about the notebook is that it's not just useful for an instruction session or teaching students in a class some programming or technical skills. We've been using it pretty consistently since the pandemic started in the Digital Scholarship Lab at Brock University for various different things. So, like, first of all, we pivoted to online and started doing all of our workshops, much like everyone. And we used this paradigm where we foisted a notebook to users, work through it together, and we always got high feedback that it was a useful method. Another in-class activity that Cal and I participated in the fall semester was analyzing some data and having an engaged conversation around it for students in a communications class. But the idea was we didn't focus on, this is how you write the code to generate this data. It was this interactive sort of session where they just ran the cells that we gave them. They analyzed the data, talked about it, and it was a really good test bed because things became interactive. It wasn't just looking at a series of charts. You could generate and change them yourself. And then, that's teaching, and then you can also get into research ends, right? So we're working on a grant project where we have 400 gigs of website archives that we're trying to make accessible to a researcher that's putting a manuscript together. And so we have a notebook that sits on top of all of that data and pulls out pieces and generates data. And the good news is that researcher doesn't need to know a lick about programming. All they need to do is ask us for certain dynamics, and we can provide that in the notebook. And then finally, Library Juice Academy, if any of you are familiar, there's a Python for Librarians class there that is run totally in like a notebook environment. So it's very useful for asynchronous, synchronous, and research collaborations. Okay, so look at the next slide here. So the workflow is very similar to what we've seen with Hugo. The notebook file itself is basically just like a fancy Python file. You can fire up that in any kind of framework you like. You take a copy of your completed version, you put it into GitHub, and then you share a version, or you share a link to that with the learners in your class. And they click on the button, it pulls in the notebook from the GitHub environment, launches it into Google Colab, and allocates the resources. And then in a matter of a couple seconds, you have your learners on the same page as you, up and running, ready to start learning about the programming language without futzing about with anything to do with installing software. I'm going to put a link in the chat box, and I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And what we're going to do is just look at a modified version of a notebook that we use for our Introduction to Text Analysis class. In our case, however, I've added some annotations to this notebook that kind of are meta. So we'll see some referential sort of stuff about this notebook is about this notebook. And I'll encourage you all to pull up this page, which is generated with Hugo. And then there's a link here for example notebook. If you're so inclined and you want to follow along with me, that's great. If you just want to watch and just sort of see how this unfolds, also very good. Our structure of the workshops we offer in the lab always follow this sort of trajectory. You fire up a Google Colab notebook, you run through it, and then you have your users engage with it as well. So this is the experience once it's fired up and running in the Colab space. There's a couple preparatory steps. I won't belabor them too much. You take a copy of the notebook and save it to your drive. So when learners disconnect from the session and return back to it later, they have a living copy of their software or the thing that they've read or learned alongside you. And then the other thing I'll do, just to make things a little easier, I'll make sure line numbers are showing. And there we go. So as I scroll down this page, anytime I have an annotation that describes sort of the page and what it is, you get a nota bene. So here's the deal. This is a riff on our text analysis workshop. And this text analysis workshop comes down to two components, parsing text and analyzing text. And what exactly does that mean? Well, let's figure it out. So as I had mentioned, each of these pages have two different types of cells, a markdown cell and a code cell. So knowing that time is kind of against us, I won't go through this too slowly, but I will ask you at certain points to participate and try on your own, and at times, ask you for your feedback in the chat box about how things are going. But our first attempt here to modify this, what we're going to do is select this cell so we can see it. It's highlighted, double click it, and then it's in this sort of intermediate HTML-like structure called Markdown. So the thing is, you just change the text the way you want. You select out of it, the cell saves, and off you go. Okay, so let's just hustle down a little bit here. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is that once you click into one of these code cells, you get this play button that shows up. So once you click this play button, you see some gears and knobs twirling and whirling. You absolutely can make these changes if you want. I should have, I needed to be more specific with my instructions. So if you start on this homepage, click on that example notebook. That'll put you exactly where I am. Sorry, a little bit of jitters. I'm missing some important steps. You set up the environment, you click the code cell, the first code cell, you get a little run button. If things work out correctly, you get green check marks, and then you get a little status bar here telling you how good your virtual machine is doing. And so here now we're starting to dig into the content. So with these code cell or with these markdown cells, you can put any kind of HTML code you want into it, right? So we're going to just put a little teaser image of what our corpus is going to be that we're going to investigate. And we have a digitized diary from over 100 years ago in our archives. We transcribed it, wrapped it up in some metadata, and created it into a machine readable thing. So we get to our next code cell here, hit the run button. And here's where things get particularly interactive. We've set the stage, we've described what we want to do. And now we have a panel of live interactive data that you can use and sort of thumb through what's in your data set. So this is a diary. Each page of that diary represents a particular day. What's very good about Winnie Beam, the author of this diary, is she wrote every day in a pretty consistent manner. So it's really apples to apples when you look at her entries, which is great. So with the corpus established, let's just take a minute to sort of introduce this idea of sentiment. So we have these algorithms that we can apply to text learning or text to generate these numbers that represent how positive a sentence is or how subjective a sentence is. And in our cell here, we have this on display. So we hit the run button, we get some results prompted to the screen. And then here's where we'll take a moment to actually investigate something. So you can create a lot of teachable moments in these notebook scenarios where you just write some code, introduce some ideas, and then stop and pause. Ask your learners to try the same thing themselves, which is exactly what I'm going to try to do with you all here. We'll just take a moment and I'll ask you to attempt question number 1 if you have the notebook running and in front of you. So to experiment with sentiment and how well an automatic sentiment calculation works, why don't we put in some sentences and see what kind of scoring we get? So I have a basic sentence here that says this is a happy sentence. I get a sentiment of, a polarity of 1, meaning very positive, and a subjectivity of 1, meaning also very subjective. So I'll pause right here, give you all 30, 45 seconds to try changing this sentence to different things, hitting the run button, and observing the results. If you find anything that's particularly goofy or interesting, please copy and paste the sentence you wrote into the chat box, and I can sort of talk about it, and we can all replicate your results. So I'll pause there. As I mentioned, let you try that out. Please don't leave me hanging. If you come across an interesting sentence, plop it in the chat box, and we'll try it out.
Yeah, all you have to do is change the text that's highlighted there. You don't have to mess around with anything else. So Kimberly had, "Mom is a wonderful lady."
There we go. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. So the idea here is, if you want to interrogate the idea of sentiment, you can start putting in different sentences. Yeah, unfortunately, you have to hit the play button on all the cells above before getting to this cell, right? So that's one of the drawbacks, is that these are all progressively built up. Yeah, I mean, here's the real challenge. Sometimes you need to really start off slow, make sure everything's working for everyone in the room. But I mean, I'm happy to help troubleshoot afterwards. As I said, time is kind of the enemy against us here. Oh, interesting. So now let's just pick it up to the next step here, where we're going to take sentiment scores and calculate them all onto the different entries in the diary, and then put it together into the data set and sort of build it up even more. And we're going to do all that. We're going to abstract all the details of how that works just by hitting this play button. And then I'll, as part of the instruction, take a look at this code afterwards if you're interested in seeing sort of the dynamics of how it works. We display now the data set of our diary, and we see that there's a couple of additional columns. Very good. We're starting to pick up this and build this on this idea of sentiment. So now let's really knock it out of the park and introduce a visualization. So we've enriched this data set. Let's see what kind of sense of it we can make. So we can plot out the polarity scores, so the negative versus positive sort of sentiment over the course of the year. And we see some interesting spikes and some interesting troughs, or some spikes in either direction, I should say. All right. So, and here's an interesting idea, or interesting way you can develop an idea over subsequent cells and subsequent bits of code. So you say, here's what we learned with sentiment. Now here, let's map out the sentiment. Now let's see if we can dig into the sentiment a little bit. And that's what our next investigation is going to be. Yay. So I'm going to just wave my magic wand and say, what I'm going to do is pick the highest 20%, or the scores in the highest 20% range and the scores in the lowest 20% range. And then I'm going to find all of the sentiment scores that match those, display those to the screen. So that's what my first cell is doing here, setting my threshold. Then this cell, I'm going to hit the run button. And what I'm going to do is now see those negative peaks all in one spot. So this is where you can have a discussion now with the learners to say, here's the polarity score that this activity generated. Do you think that's a valid description, or do you think that these algorithms are functioning correctly? And then on the flip side, we have the positive sentiment scores, and we can sort of see how the algorithm scores those to really, have a discussion of how accurate they are based on your intuition. Okay, so I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to take up too much, and there's probably, a lot more in this notebook than we'll accomplish. So maybe I'll just take a look at a couple of different key things here and forego some of the discussion-y points, because unfortunately, I don't think we'll have the ability to do that. So let's say we're interested in digging into text, or these entries in this diary, a little bit more. So what we can do is just randomly pick one and start applying different kinds of analyses to it. So we can look at the sentences inside of an entry and how the sentiment score changes in between each sentence. We can also break up the sentences into words if we're interested in getting a really granular count of things. And then here's what I will, I think, gloss over. Actually, no, I won't gloss over. So here's an opportunity, like you can present all of these distinct ideas and then you can stop and create opportunities for your learners to explore the data on their own, sort of within the bounds, right? So you wouldn't say, here's one entry, tell me what you think of it. Like with question 3 here. So let's pick a random journal entry, and you can take the opportunity to ask the learners in your class to do that. So pick a random number between 1 and the length of the journal or of the diary. So we know we have 363 entries. Let's change a bit of code here and just pick a random entry and start experimenting. So we'll hit 56, hit the run button, and then we can see a sentiment score sort of laid out on the screen that demonstrates sort of the calculation. And here's where you can say to everyone in the class, why don't you take a look, pick some random entries, pull out what's interesting, and report back to the class with what entry number it was, and we can all explore together. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this idea of sentiment versus stop words versus lemmatization. I will encourage you very gladly to try this out after the session is done, and you have our contact information, so I'd love to hear back from you afterwards, not just on the learning, but as like the how this is as a framework to present learning. Okay. So I'll finish off by just introducing the last activity that I think highlights another really great dynamic of using a notebook. What we're going to do with this last task, is like fetch information from the internet, process it, and then look at some results. And if you build in time into the activity, you can actually allow students to recreate and attempt themselves. So basically what we're going to do is create an automatic keyword generator. And this is a progression of all the things that we've learned as we've experimented with the notebook. But basically what we're going to do is grab or identify a corpus. And in this case, what we're going to do is just grab a copy of the book, The Prince from Gutenberg, chew through it, calculating the different noun phrases or the words that are, noun phrases, self-explanatory, I hope, that are in the document, create a frequency diagram of them, and then also calculate some other sentiment stuff, right? So we can now create a sort of glanceable frequency distribution of the top words that were used in this book. And so we see that Machiavelli used the term Castruccio, which I imagine is a family somewhere in Venice. And he talks about the Florentine, or somewhere in Italy. He's talking about the Florentines and all sorts of things. So it's a really cool way to pull in data from the internet now, and you give it a try. Right. And then you can have some discussions about the results that learners have. So mindful of the time, I'll just describe this, but I won't actually click the run button. Now with all these pieces built, the interactive code sort of taken care of, the learners are understanding the what and the how, but they don't need to look at the code specifically. You can create an activity that pulls in all the different things that you've learned. And in this case, I'm requesting plop in a URL from a particular place, put it in, get a sentiment score, look at the noun phrases, and then compare that against another web page from a different organization covering the similar topic, just to sort of see what kind of stuff you have. And then, it proceeds from there. And I'll take this opportunity to thank you all for sitting through that presentation. I encourage you to take a look through it. But I will pause here, and before we switch it back to questions more generally, I'll just ask, now that you've had a chance to sort of see it and go in the chat box or over the microphone if you want, what is your take on this model? Do you think this is something useful? Do you think a notebook is a pedagogically sound method? Or, if so, can you see any uses that you would have for it in your line of work or in your teaching?
The reason why we want to talk to you today is because we wanted to talk about infrastructure that's available to you at a relatively low cost, relatively accessible, and largely open source. And the two examples that we walked through today, one affects the way that you would develop open educational resources on your campus and with your students. And the other is how you would affect the student learning experience, whether it's a synchronous learning experience in the classroom or an asynchronous one, where you can ask them to review a notebook ahead of time and come to class with questions about it. So for the OER, there's a pipeline there that I've showed you using GitHub Pages, Hugo, and H5P to create what I think are high quality learning. And then for open learning, software like Jupyter Notebooks and something like Google Colab or Binder limit the technological bottlenecks that, Tim, you've just described, and allow for essentially an even playing field in terms of access to a particular lesson. And so hopefully you found this useful and has given you some ideas about how you might apply it at your campus. Again, my name is Cal and Tim, and we'd be really happy to talk to you further if you want to contact us via email or on Twitter. And if it's all the same with you, Tim, we'll just take some questions now before we let everybody go finish your notebook.
Absolutely.
All right.
So I'll just respond quickly to what's in the chat box. Yes, please, by all means, goof around with the notebook that you have in front of you. That is now cloned and running in your own environment that Google Colab has bootstrapped for you. So yeah, feel free to save it, share it, remix it, and do whatever you need with it.